Hi guys and welcome back. So we are in our America GCSE unit and today we're going to be looking at one of the most remarkable, shocking events in American history. It had an impact that resonated throughout the entire world, and it is of course the Wall Street crash. So in this video, we're going to look at why it happened, and I'm going to go through, first of all, kind of the context of the situation. So who was president at the time and things like that, just so you understand. And then I'm going to go through the two main reasons why the Wall Street crashed. Now, after that, I'm going to kind of, there's a smaller reason as well, a third smaller reason. So I'm going to go through that, and then I'm going to give you a timeline of the whole event so you know exactly what happened. Okay, so here we go. Now, in 1928, there was a presidential election, and Herbert Hoover, who was the Republican candidate, so remember what Republicans stand for, laissez-faire, low taxes, low intervention, letting people do it on their own, not getting involved, okay? So this presidential election, Herbert Hoover, the Republican candidate, was standing. Now, nobody doubted that the Republicans would win again. The US economy was still booming. We know that. We've looked at the boom. And after so much success, why would they lose? His opponent was a man called Al Smith, an Irish Catholic and a wet. So somebody who was an opponent of prohibition, somebody who supported bringing an end to prohibition. Now, he was a highly successful governor of New York. Despite that, Hoover won in an absolute landslide, and everything seemed well. One of his earliest statements as president was, "We in America today are nearer the final triumph over poverty than ever before." He also made statements like, everyone's going to have a chicken in every pot. Lots of kind of rhetoric, so lots of messages from him about prosperity, about success, about escaping poverty, the boom in America, all of that kind of messaging coming from Hoover. Now, when Hoover formally moved into the White House in March 1929, the mood of confidence was still there. He pointed out that Americans had more bathtubs, oil furnaces, and bank accounts than any other country in the world. 6 months later, however, it was a very different picture. In October 1929, the Wall Street stock market crashed. The American economy collapsed, and the USA entered a long depression that destroyed much of the prosperity of the 1920s. So what went wrong? Well, some say that Hoover and the Republicans should have seen it coming and done something about it. Others say that at the time no one could have really known, what was about to happen. But let's have a look at the specific reasons. So, first of all, we have something called speculation. Now, investment on the stock market would be quite attractive during an economic boom. The American economy was doing well throughout the 1920s, and because the economy kept doing well, there were more share buyers than sellers, and the value of shares rose. So, if more people want to buy, then we have more demand for the product. So, the price of the product can go up because we have people competing over purchasing it. If you know you're going to sell your product, you can make it more expensive. If I run a business and I charge £50 for my product, but I reach a point where I know I'm going to have, I've got 10,000 followers on Instagram, all who want to buy my product, and they're all kind of shouting for it, and I don't have enough stock. Well, I know that if I make it £70 or £75, I've got 5 people per one product I'm trying to sell. So if one of those people finds it too expensive, well, I've got 4 others who might be willing to purchase it. Okay, so if more people want to buy something, the price of the item goes up. So at this time, we have lots of people buying stocks, and I had a whole video on that where I went through why normal, ordinary people were buying stocks on the stock market. So lots and lots of ordinary people buying stocks and shares on the stock market, lots of people buying, nobody really selling, okay? Now, it seems that many Americans saw the stock market as an easy and quick way to get rich. Anyone could buy shares, watch their value rise, and then sell them at a later higher price. And so many Americans decided to join the stock market. Now, in 1920, there had only been 4 million share owners in America. By 1929, there were 20 million out of a population of 120 million, although only about 1.5 million of this 20 were big investors. So people who did this for a living, companies that actually specialized in doing this. Around 600,000 new investors were speculators. Now, speculation is a form of gambling. Speculators don't intend to keep their shares for long. They borrow money to buy some shares, then sell them again as soon as the price has risen. They pay off the loan and still have a quick profit to show for it. In the 1920s, speculators didn't even have to pay the full value of shares. They could buy on the margin, which meant they only had to put down 10% of the cash needed to buy the shares, and they would borrow the rest. So you're borrowing huge amounts of money to gamble in the hope that your stock rises, and then you're going to sell it, pay back the bank, and keep the profit. Now, that's all well and good if you know the odds are always in your favor. If you know the stocks are always going to rise, there's no risk to it. But obviously, the idea of gambling is that there is always a risk, and the stock market is exactly the same. Whilst everyone was super confident and saw these stocks rising all the time, more and more people bought into it, only to realize at a later date, which we'll get to in a moment, that stocks don't necessarily always rise. Now, one group in particular that became heavily involved in speculation were women, and women speculators owned over 50% of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which became known as the Petticoat line. It was not only individuals who speculated, banks themselves got involved and certainly did nothing to hold it back. American banks lent $9 billion for speculation in 1929. So that's $9 billion of other people's savings being lent to unexperienced speculators to gamble. Now, if you imagine it wasn't speculating or buying stocks, if we were literally talking about gambling, how would you feel about your savings that you've put into a bank for safekeeping being lent to somebody to go gambling on a Saturday night? You wouldn't feel very happy, would you? So, through most of the 1920s, the rise of share prices was quite steady. There were even some downturns. But in 1928, speculation really took hold. Demand for shares was at an all-time high, and prices were rising at an unheard of rate. The more people that speculate, the higher the price is going to get because more people want to buy. So, as long as we have demand, prices are going to go up. But the problem is, well, I'm actually going to save the explanation of that for our second reason. But this is essentially the situation that we've got. So in March, Union Carbide, that's a company, shares stood at $145. By September of 1928, they had risen to 413. That's around 3 times the price. One vital ingredient of all of this was confidence. If people are confident that prices will keep rising, there will be more buyers than sellers. However, if they think prices might stop rising, all of a sudden there'll be more sellers and a crash. The whole structure will come down. And this is exactly what happened in 1929. As the banks had lent so much money out, when share prices fell, people couldn't pay the loans back, the banks went bankrupt. Now, the second problem in all of this was overproduction. American factories were overproducing. They were making goods faster than they could sell them. We know this because we had the invention of the assembly line, we had mass production, we have all those amazing statistics that you picked out and learnt about the production of radios, cars, TVs, bringing a better life to Americans all over America. However, these factories are still pouring these goods out all the time on these assembly lines, and they don't have the market anymore to sell them. Now, the boom was based on the increased sale of consumer goods. The market for these goods was largely the rich and middle class, but by 1929, those who could afford consumer goods had already bought them. Not all Americans had the wealth to buy luxury goods, even on generous hire purchase schemes, and there was a limit to the number of cars, radios, telephones, and fridges that people could buy. You don't need more than one fridge. You don't need more than one microwave. You don't need more than one car, really, perhaps 2, but there's always going to be a limit. It's not like something where you're going to endlessly buy and buy and buy. So all the wealthy people who wanted and could afford these items had already bought them. So now we've got warehouses full of these items with nobody to purchase them. And the companies themselves don't even have the money from the items they have sold because they've sold them on hire purchase. Now, the construction industry, one of the leading signs of health in an economy, had actually started its downturn as far back as 1926. You've already noted as well the decline of the old traditional industries such as coal and agriculture. There were also other concerns such as the unequal distribution of wealth and the precarious state of some of the banks. In the decade before the crash, over 500 banks had failed each year. These were mainly small banks who lent too much. So that idea that, that we didn't see this coming actually isn't really true, because if you look at all these facts I've just told you, there's evidence that years ahead of the Wall Street crash, things were starting to go down, and actually this world of prosperity that had been created was far more of an appearance than the reality. Now, companies had tried high pressure advertising. In 1929, American industry spent a staggering $3 billion on magazine advertising. But with workers' wages not rising and prices not falling, sales did not improve and demand decreased. So the problem with that really is the fact that companies are not actually worth what they're being valued to be worth on the stock market. Their shares might be rising exponentially because so many different speculators want to buy shares in the company. So the price is rising because the demand is there, but that price does not reflect the actual value and worth of the company. So if the stock market was to crash, there's not really any reality behind the money that people are investing in the stock market. Their shares aren't actually worth the price they've paid for them. They are simply paying that price because there's loads and loads of people that want to buy them. Okay. So it's not anymore really about buying a piece of a company or buying a piece of, a piece of that company. It's about buying a ticket with a name on it as a gambling game, essentially, and trying to see how long you can hold it without losing money. And that's really the problem. The companies themselves do not have very much money because they have sold loads of goods on hire purchase where they're only getting 10% of the worth of the product, and they can no longer sell any more goods. They're stuck in factories with no profit at all. They're actually, many of these factories and many of these companies are now operating at a loss. So that is the essential problem. Now, I'm just going to go through the third factor. It's a bit smaller and not as important, but this is the idea of foreign tariffs. Now, in the past, American industry would have tried to export surplus goods. So, all these factories full of cars and radios and things like that, we would have just tried to sell them abroad. But at this time, people in Europe couldn't afford American goods either. In addition, after 9 years of American tariffs, European governments had placed their own taxes on US made goods to protect its industries and encourage consumers to buy goods made in their own country. So, kind of, America is now feeling the effects of those same policies they followed at the start of the boom: high tariffs to import goods, concentration on purchasing American products. Well, the same thing's now happening in Europe. Britain is putting high tariffs on any imported American goods. Same with France, same with, Italy, places like that. And people don't want to buy the more expensive American goods. So therefore, they have no foreign markets to sell their products to. Now, speculators on the American Stock Exchange became nervous about the value of their shares and began to sell because of all these things I've just said. Warehouses full of goods, companies not actually being worth the money they have been valued at. The slide in share value started slowly, but throughout September and October, it gathered pace. Many investors had borrowed money to buy their shares and couldn't afford to be stuck with shares worth less than the value of their loan. So people are getting scared. They've borrowed 90% of the share price. If their share drops below 90% of what they purchased, they won't be able to pay back their loan. So suddenly, out of fear, people are just going to start selling because they think, all right, well, I can afford to pay back my loan. I might not make a profit, but who cares? I can pay it back. Fantastic. Sell. Done. But if everyone starts selling at the same time, that's when suddenly the value of the share is not as much anymore because people don't want it anymore. Soon, other investors sold their shares, and within days, panic set in. Shareholders had realized that their shares were only worth something if someone was willing to buy them. As they tried to turn their shares into cash, they dropped their price to attract a buyer. And that's how the Wall Street crash happened. if you think about it, what you have is only worth what somebody really is willing to pay. If you're willing to pay £25 for a t-shirt, that's what you're going to pay for it, and you'll go and find the t-shirt that costs £25. If you are sat there with millions in your bank, you might be able to spend £2,500 on a t-shirt, and you'll go and find a t-shirt that costs that much for you. But what you're selling is only worth what somebody is willing to pay. So when everybody starts selling their shares, nobody wants to buy them anymore. So the price gets lower and lower and lower as everyone's thinking, okay, well, I need to sell, so I'll go a tiny bit lower so I can sell and get rid of it. And in that way, everybody does it at the same time, and we get a situation where the share prices drop. I'm just going to go through a quick timeline for you to summarize the events of the crash itself so you can see really, really clearly. Now, in March 1929, people are confident and shares are booming. By September, a few cautious people begin to sell their shares. Now, on the 24th of October, a day that we call Black Thursday, 13 million shares are sold on the New York Stock Exchange, which was 5 times higher than any normal day. The price of a share in the General Electric Company, for example, fell from $3.15 to $2.18. Once the rush to sell began, the situation only got worse, and on the 29th of October, there was another mad panic to sell at any price. 16 million shares were sold, and the average price of a share dropped 40 cents. Shareholders lost an astonishing $8,000 million. It became clear to the speculators that the banks were not going to intervene to support the price of shares, and so Wall Street had its busiest and worst day in history. Now, if you want to find out what happens in terms of impact and consequences, you need to watch the next video focused on that. There we have a summary of the causes and what happened in the Wall Street crash.